This phase of the lecture is just going through the different macronutrients and micronutrients and talking about some of their characteristics relative to trees. Now, one thing I want to say up front is that most of the data and knowledge we have about mineral nutrition comes from research on crop plants. So the reality is that we actually know a lot more about mineral nutrition of crop plants than we do of forest trees. And really, we know more about mineral nutrition of like horticultural trees or orchard trees or fruit trees than we do of forest trees. So forest trees were a bit behind. Now, but we can be guided by a piece of wisdom that Tom Fox uh, often likes to say. Tom Fox is a scientist at Rainier. He's also has been a professor of forest soils at Virginia Tech University. So he's one of the country's leading experts on mineral nutrition of forest trees. And Tom would always say, the most important thing we need to remember about tree nutrition is that trees are plants. And what he meant from that was that we can infer a lot about mineral nutrition of trees from what we've learned from crop plants. So with that in mind, let's talk about the different elements and some. So we're just going to fill out these tables in your handout. And what this will do is we'll talk about the function of these elements in the tree. For some of the elements, we'll talk about how common the deficiency is in forest trees. And then for some of the elements, there are some special notes. Some of these blanks or cells will remain blank. But for nitrogen, the importance of nitrogen in the tree is that every amino acid contains a nitrogen atom in it. So in other words, nitrogen is abundant in not only amino acids, but therefore also proteins and enzymes and so on. So nitrogen is critical for that. Nitrogen is also important for chlorophyll synthesis. So it's not necessarily a big component of chlorophyll, but it's important for the synthesis or the construction of chlorophyll. Deficiency, nitrogen is probably most common deficiency worldwide, both for crops and for forest trees. So nitrogen deficiency is very common in both crop plants and in forest trees. Phosphorus. We've talked a lot about phosphorus through its role in a couple of things. One, high energy phosphate bonds. So for instance, ATP. Right? So phosphorus is really important for those energy containing molecules. And we've also talked about how phosphate are important for sugar transformation reactions. Ribulose bisphosphate is a phosphorylated 5-carbon sugar, and it must be phosphorylated to be transformed in the first step of the Calvin cycle. So phosphorus is important for that reason. In terms of deficiency, phosphorus is probably the second most common deficiency, and it's especially can be a problem in Australia, New Zealand. It is a problem in the southeastern US and in many tropical countries. Okay, so phosphorus deficiency is pretty common. Potassium, later on when we study water relations, we'll learn more about how guard cells open and close, but potassium plays a key role in the opening and closing of guard cells, and more broadly, osmoregulation. So the regulation of turgor, or how much water there is in cells, potassium plays an important role in that. Special note about potassium is that potassium is highly mobile. So it is moved around easily in trees. And for that reason, when we see deficiency of potassium show up on leaves, deficiency symptoms tend to appear first on old leaves. Why is that? That's because, and I'll draw a little picture here. If you have a tree here with, old leaves on the bottom and newer leaves on the top, most mineral elements are not available in abundance. So they're almost always, a rare commodity. So as this tree is producing new leaves, it needs, for instance, potassium to produce new leaves. And because potassium is highly mobile, potassium can be easily retranslocated from those old leaves up to the apical meristem to produce new leaves. When that happens, we will see deficiency symptoms occur first here on the older leaves, because that potassium is easily essentially remobilized or mined from older leaves and used to produce those higher priority new leaves. So when potassium deficiency symptoms show up in leaves, it's usually first on the older leaves. Okay, let's talk about sulfur. Sulfur is a constituent of several amino acids and enzymes. And it's important for membrane function. Okay, that's all I got on that. Calcium. Calcium often accumulates in cell walls. And it affects, it is used, it's involved in the elasticity of cell walls. So when cells are expanding, and those signals occur which increase the elasticity of the walls so the cell can expand, calcium is involved in that. In addition, this is probably also related to cell wall, calcium deficiency affects fruit storage. So for instance, apples from a tree with a calcium deficiency, they'll rot more quickly than from a tree with sufficient calcium. And then magnesium, oops, I forgot to mention for calcium. Calcium, because it occurs in cell walls, it's highly immobile. So it's in contrast to potassium. So therefore, we would expect the opposite in terms of deficiency symptoms. Deficiency symptoms of calcium occur first on new leaves. So as a tree basically is running out of calcium, as those new leaves are constructed, that calcium can't be remobilized from elsewhere in the tree, and so we would tend to see deficiency symptoms first on the newer leaves. And then finally, magnesium is a chlorophyll constituent. If you look at molecular structure of the chlorophyll molecule, there's a magnesium atom right in the middle of it. So it's an important constituent of chlorophyll. Okay, this is the table for the micronutrients. These are required in much smaller quantities than the macronutrients, in some cases vanishingly small. So while some of the macronutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus occur in compounds that are abundant and they're an important part of those, in a lot of cases these micronutrients are like cofactors of enzymes and they're required in much smaller quantities for that reason. In addition, what I said previously about crop plants is very much so here in that we understand very little about the functions of micronutrients specifically in trees. Most of the research in these micros has been done in crop plants. So iron. Iron is involved in synthesis of chloroplast proteins. So photosynthetic proteins. And also is a cofactor in respiratory enzymes. Okay. In terms of deficiency, iron is probably the most common micronutrient deficiency. And this is interesting because in general there is abundant iron in soils, but it's more available at low pH, so in acid soils. So for instance, in Oklahoma, where I grew up, the soils are actually red. They're red because they have so much iron in them. But in those soils, iron deficiency is quite common. And that's because of the pH of those soils. Those soils are derived from prairies, and prairie soils tend to be neutral to a little bit basic. Whereas here in the southeastern US, for instance, many of our soils are quite acidic. And what that means is that iron deficiency is much less common in our soils because that iron that is in the soil is readily available at that low pH. Iron, sort of like calcium, is relatively immobile. Copper is an enzyme constituent, which is sort of generic. Interesting thing about copper is it's toxic at higher concentrations. One way to think about that is that zone of luxury consumption for copper is relatively narrow. So it may be, that you cross that zone of nutrient limitation for copper, you move into luxury consumption, but if you add just a little bit more copper, it can become toxic. So that zone of luxury consumption is pretty narrow for copper. And that's even more so for boron, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Boron is important for carbohydrate transport and metabolism. A lot of these are sort of very general and vague. Um, Boron deficiency is actually fairly common. Boron deficiency, along with iron, is probably, the most common micronutrient deficiency. Like I said, boron is toxic like copper, but maybe even more so. The toxic concentration of boron is only slightly more than the optimal concentration. In other words, that zone of luxury consumption is very narrow for boron. This has implications for boron fertilization. So, I mentioned that boron deficiency is fairly common, which means that we sometimes do need to fertilize with boron, but you have to be careful how much boron you put on, because it is possible to kill trees or other crops with boron fertilizer. And because it's a micronutrient, it's required in pretty small amounts. So when boron is applied as a fertilizer in forests, it's applied at a rate of maybe 1 pound per acre. So if you think of, a pound of boron element, I don't know what the mass of molecular weight of boron is, but a pound of elemental boron, is probably the size of a tennis ball, something like that. So imagine having to fertilize and spread out that tennis ball size quantity of boron over an acre, the size of a football field. And if you apply too much, you can poison the trees. So fertilization of micronutrients is tricky. And usually micronutrient fertilizers are, for instance, coated onto macronutrient fertilizers, for instance. To give you an idea of quantities, I said typical fertilization quantity in forests for boron would be 1 pound per acre of the element. For nitrogen, for instance, you might apply anywhere from 100 to 250 pounds per acre of elemental nitrogen in a fertilizer event, and maybe a tenth of that for phosphorus. So maybe 10 to 25 pounds per acre of phosphorus. So those macronutrients, when you fertilize, you put a greater quantity of that material out as well. But at any rate, that's a special thing with boron. Molybdenum is involved in nitrogen metabolism. And as far as we know, deficiency is not common in forest or orchard trees. And probably one of the reasons is that less than 1 part per million is necessary for optimum concentration. Molybdenum is needed in the smallest quantity of any element. So that's probably one reason that it's seldom, if ever, deficient, is because it doesn't take much. And there's usually enough molybdenum in the soil to sustain the tree. Manganese is also involved in chlorophyll synthesis. and it's an activator for some enzymes. And zinc is similar. Zinc is an enzyme cofactor. Don't have many other factoids about those two elements. Chlorine is involved in the light reactions of photosynthesis. And this is another element where deficiency is not common. So those are the facts on the macro and micronutrients.